In this practice, I'm going to show you how you can implement implicit measures with Power Pivot for Excel. Power Pivot for Excel allows you to implement two types of custom measures: implicit measures and explicit measures. An implicit measure is any column that is added to the value zone of the Power Pivot field list. For example, when we implemented the sales by country report, we added the sales amount to the value zone in the Power Pivot field list. Consequently, Power Pivot has determined that this column is a numeric column, and it has defaulted its function, its aggregation function, to sum, which I can see by expanding the drop down here and clicking Edit Measure. This dialog box, the Measure Settings dialog box, allows me to change the name of the implicit measure and also to see what kind of aggregation function is used. And if I don't want this aggregation function, I can override it to use each one of the standard aggregation functions that Power Pivot for Excel supports, which is count, minimum, maximum, average, and distinct count. Let's understand how the measure actually is calculated. At runtime, for each cell on the report, Power Pivot determines the context of the cell. For example, this particular cell that I selected is found at coordinates Australia on rows, 2008, year 2008 on columns, and also the report is filtered on bikes product category. So all of these filters essentially flow into the context of that measure, and Power Pivot use them to filter the results of the measure when it evaluates the formula. That's why each cell in this report has different values, because each cell is found at different countries, years, and so forth. Now, what about if I add a non-numeric column as an implicit measure? For example, I drag the customer PO number to the value zone. Because that's a non-numeric column, Power Pivot is going to default to the count aggregation function, as you can see here, which count or distinct count are probably the only two functions, the only two functions that apply to text-based measures. Now, what about if you want to default the measure to a particular function, just to save you a few clicks? So instead of going and overriding the measure aggregation function, you want, when you drag that measure on the report, to automatically default to one of the standard aggregation functions. You can do that very easily. For example, suppose let's say that you want, when you add the product standard cost measure to your report, you want that calculation to default to average. Let's go to the Power Pivot window, and with the reseller sales table selected, let's go and find the product standard cost. Now, this is considered an advanced feature, defaulting the aggregation behavior. So if the advanced tab doesn't show, expand the drop down here and click switch to advanced mode. And then in the advanced tab, you will see something called summarize by. If you expand that, by default, Power Pivot is going to figure out what kind of aggregation is going to apply to that column. And again, for numeric columns, this is going to be a sum aggregation function. But let's say in this case, we want to default to an average function. So I'm going to select the average. And then when I go back to Excel and refresh, and then when I add the product standard cost measure to my report, then as you can see, it defaults to the average aggregation function. So this is how, using this summarize by, you can specify the default aggregation function for your implicit measures. Finally, I want to show you how you can visualize, how you can see what kind of implicit measures you have in your model. Let's go back to Power Pivot window, and let's go and click the in the Advanced tab, click on Show, click Show Implicit Measures. As you can see in the data view, the calculation area shows the implicit measures. Each one of those cells that have this special icon essentially is an implicit measure. If the measure is grayed out, appears grayed out, that means that it's not being used in the reports in your Power Pivot workbook. Perhaps you used it at the very beginning in one report, but then you took it out, so that measure is not longer used, but its calculation, its definition, it's still there in the Power Pivot model. And the ones that are not grayed out are actually being used on the reports. You can also see that in the diagram view, assuming that you enabled in the Advanced tab that feature to see the implicit measures. When you go to the diagram view and you go to a particular table, you will see the implicit measures having a orange dot indicator. If that indicator is solid orange, then this measure is active, is being used on the report. And if it's a little bit kind of pure graying out, not that solid orange color, then is not being used on the report.